Well, hello from Canberra. It's Peter Jennings here. I'm the Executive Director of ASPI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar, which we will be launching a brand new book, ANZUS at 70. And we have a fantastic guest list of folks who are going to make some observations about the book and about the alliance relationship with the United States. I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Brendan Nelson, who will be known to many of you online, President of Boeing Australia, New Zealand and South Pacific, Chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia, or AmCham, a Board Director of the United States Studies Centre and a member of the ASPI Council, as well as a former Cabinet Minister. Brendan, it's great to have you with us. We're also joined by Michelle Grattan, Professorial Fellow at the University of Canberra, Chief Political Correspondent for The Conversation, and a member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery for more than 40 years, during which time Michelle has covered all of the most significant stories in Australian politics. Michelle was the former editor of the Canberra Times and political editor of The Age, and has also worked for the Australian Financial Review and the Sydney Morning Herald. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you.
Soon, I hope we will be joined by Lisa Sharland, recently of ASPI, but now Adjunct Senior Fellow with the Stimson Centre with Protecting the Civilians in Conflict program. Her research is focused on UN peace operations reform, peacekeeping effectiveness, protection of civilians, preventing and countering violent extremism, and women, peace and security. So hopefully we'll see Lisa very soon. And then towards the end of our session, I'll introduce April Palmer-Lee, CEO of AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. The connection with AmCham is very much evident in this book. It is a joint publication between AmCham and ASPI. I want to thank AmCham for their support in making it happen. I also want to thank Patrick Walters, who has done a fantastic job editing the book and producing a multiple author study in a very quick period of time. So what we're going to do, folks, is we'll hear from Brendan, Michelle and Lisa making some opening comments. I'm then going to just put a few questions to each of them to get ourselves warmed up. And you'll notice on the webinar that on the right-hand side of the screen, you have an opportunity to type in questions, and we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes or so where you will be able to have your questions put by me to our speakers. So please start to think about what you would like to ask, and we'll see if we can work our way through those questions in the second part of the webinar. And I'll be closing at about 6:30 p.m. Canberra time, so about an hour or so from now. Well, let's get started. Brendan, it's great to see you there. Thank you so much for taking the time to appear on the webinar, and thank you also for writing the excellent conclusion to our volume. Let me hand over to you for about 10 minutes or so. The floor is yours, Brendan.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you also to Michelle and Lisa for playing such a significant role in the launch of the publication. Congratulations to you, to Patrick Walters, a brilliant job editing the volume, and the contributors for the quality of the papers that have been contributed to it is a credit to ASPI, of which I also declare I'm a director, and as the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia, on behalf of our 400 members, thank you for what is a landmark publication. I recognise from wherever we're coming to this, the traditional Aboriginal people, and pay our respects to their ancestors and their elders past, present and emerging. I should also say, by the way, I'm like probably most people here in lockdown, so I'm coming from my home office in Bowral. If you're wondering about the stuff behind me, my wife will not allow anything of mine anywhere in the house other than my office, unless it's in the garage. So just to explain that to all of you. One of the paradox, I think, of us as human beings is that we very often take for granted the things that are most important to us in our lives. The US presence in the Western Pacific since the end of World War II has been the bedrock of stability, of economic prosperity, not just for our country, Australia, but also for the broader Asia Pacific, of which obviously we in the United States are a critically important part. History is absolutely essential to our understanding of the future. And when we live in a world where not much seems to make sense, history, in my experience, is the guiding discipline. A sense of history reminds us that there are important decisions that need to be made and the consequences and importance of actually making them. The alliance between Australia and the United States and New Zealand was, you'll find in the paper, born over a century. But in my own opinion, I think it was particularly events near Coral Sea in May 1942, where the United States and Royal Australian Navies inflicted a strategic defeat over Japan, which would change the course of not only 1942, the second most important year in Australia after 1788, but also the course of the war itself. When Australia emerged from the Second World War, with all of the consequences it had for our country, the three most important were that we knew, notwithstanding Sir Robert Menzies being British to his bootstraps, that we could no longer rely on Britain for our security. We would instead look across the Pacific to the United States of America. And Percy Spender, more than anybody else, had that vision and understood that. The second was, as Paul Kelly observed 15 years ago, the editor-at-large of the Australian newspaper, that it created the conditions for Australia to engage in emergent Asia on equal and respected terms. And of course, it laid the foundations for the generational struggle over at least two generations between communism and democracy. The context of the alliance, signed as it was, which we mark on the 1st of September, the 70th anniversary in San Francisco in 1951, was that in 1949, the communists had prevailed in the Chinese Civil War. The USSR was acquiring nuclear weapons. The decolonization of our region was leading to religious and politically motivated insurgencies, and China and Russia were nurturing revolution in parts of the region. We also had the United States reject the idea of a Pacific Pact, a NATO-style arrangement in our region, and Robert Menzies himself, elected in 1949, of course, was concerned that whatever arrangements were entered into of a multilateral nature should include Britain. Percy Spender in particular, our foreign minister, was critically important. His vision, his mission, determination, his diplomatic skill, the very accurate reading of the domestic political environment in both the United States and Australia, and then President Truman's decision to commit American forces to Korea, all conspired eventually to the alliance itself. There's not a day should go by in Australia where we do not give thanks publicly or privately to 300,000 American casualties in the Pacific from 1941 to the end of the war, 103,000 of them dead and half of their bodies never found. And the origin of the alliance, which came from those events which I've just outlined, then has evolved into having four key pillars: the political dimension, the diplomatic, the defense and intelligence, and of course the trade and economic. And the American Chamber of Commerce itself, only a decade after the signing of the alliance in 1951, was formed here in Australia, itself in part a product of the alliance. And the Chamber itself, its ambition has been to, and was stated at the time, to open up lines of communication, to develop opportunities that could be explored, to change thinking, and to develop economic and trade ties between our two countries. The alliance, in my opinion, has prevailed, and you see this, and in fact you, Peter, have written about it in the volume itself, that it's the simplicity. 11 articles, 800 words. And the opening sentence speaks to the entire purpose of the alliance, and that is to strengthen the fabric of peace in the Asia-Pacific. Peter also makes the observation in his paper that the Brookings Institute, which in 2010 studied 63 alliances over 500 years, identified only 10 that have endured more than 40 years. NATO, of course, being one, but the ANZUS alliance being another. And Stephen Walt in 1997, looking at what makes alliances prosper and survive, is firstly hegemonic leadership, secondly shared strategic identity and values, and the third is resolved. And the alliance itself has had all of that and more. The fundamentals, as John Howard himself writes in the volume, really rests on our shared values, values in our region and values in our world. And when you look at the alliance and you think about what are the fundamentals that our two countries in particular share, it is the belief in political, economic and religious freedoms. It is to be both nations where faith coexists alongside reason, with free academic inquiry, a free press, an independent judiciary, and all of those things that define our liberal democracies. We are both countries, as we know, in our trade and economic ties, which we've documented at AmCham through Deloitte in 2019, being worth not just the 73.9 billion in 2019 in two-way trade investment, but the direct foreign investment into Australia by the United States, which is a quarter of our FDI. That and the income produced from it means that 7% of our GDP comes from US investment, two-way trade and our ties. So whilst the most important, whilst the largest trading partner for Australia is China, our most important economic partner is the United States. So in this world that we are living in, as we go through the most consequential geopolitical realignment in our lifetime, it's critically important we do not take for granted for a single moment what has given us the freedoms that which too often we've taken for granted. And the alliance is very much at the heart of that. So I'll finish at that, Peter, and look forward to answering some questions from you.
Thanks so much, Brendan. And at least on my screen, your image was breaking up a little bit, but your audio came across very clear. So I'm sure we were all able to get the detail of the speech. Let's go directly to Michelle. Michelle, you write about John Howard and his experience of ANZUS and, of course, the shock events of 9/11, now almost exactly 20 years ago. I'd be interested to hear your reflections, not simply on what you've written, but on anything else you might like to touch on about the relationship. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Peter, and very glad to be participating in this webinar and an impressive book overall. Credit particularly to Patrick's very diligent efforts. I will range more broadly in these remarks, and I'll be talking about the alliance generally rather than the ANZUS Treaty narrowly. And in that context, let me just refer to start with to Rod Lyon's chapter. He says that reading the treaty is a good place to start in understanding the alliance, but, and I quote him, a poor place to stop. The formal alliance document is just part, or maybe, albeit maybe the core, of what is a living, evolving relationship shaped by a changing world and by a consultative framework in the form of OSMIN talks and much else. Now, we all know the immediate post-war circumstances of the forging of ANZUS, and Brendan has reminded us too of some of those. But more generally, we can put that into the wider historical context of Australia's inherent desire for security, for that great and powerful friend that has marked our history. Traditionally, of course, that friend was Britain, but the experience of World War II led to John Curtin's famous appeal to the United States, and also the actual physical experience of the war, which Brendan's alluded to. In the new post-war strategic and military landscape, ANZUS filled that gap for a powerful potential protector. And most Australians retain confidence in the protection the alliance gives us. For example, in this year's Lowy poll, 3/4 of the people interviewed believed that the United States would come to Australia's defence if Australia was under threat. The Lowy poll, running for 17 years, also shows strong support for the alliance over that period, despite varying levels of confidence in particular US leaders. Support for the alliance remained strong even when Australians were quite turned off Donald Trump. During the period of the Lowy polls, the noticeable gap was in 2007, at the end of the Bush period, and of course in the wake of the Iraq War. But the alliance still was rating 63% with the Australian respondents. A chapter in the ANZUS book tracks support through another poll, the Australian National University's election study, and it's very much worth having a look at that for the long view. Just how automatic US support for Australia would be might be open to theoretical debate, and especially in the discussion of the actual wording of the ANZUS Treaty. But in practical terms, if we're talking about conflict that posed a military threat to Australia, American aid is a totally reasonable assumption. And this is not least because, for obvious strategic reasons, it would be in the United States' national interest to provide it. Of course, that doesn't mean Australia can always get what it wants from the US, as we know from the history. The alliance brings a range of advantages for Australia apart from this umbrella of ultimate protection. Intelligence sharing is obviously a very clear benefit to us, but also the ability to get in a president's ear, as, for example, when Malcolm Turnbull was able to do that deal with President Obama to take quite a lot of Australia's offshore refugees. And the alliance relationship also made it easier for Turnbull to persuade Trump to stick to that deal, despite Trump's obvious reservations. The special relationship got us a special deal when Trump was hitting steel with tariffs. Not that it always works on the economic front, and there have been various arguments in relation to US farm protection measures over the years. So the benefits of the alliance are very obvious, and I think clearly greater than the constraints and any dangers that it brings. Nevertheless, it does bring constraints and indeed risks, and they're likely to continue. The war in Afghanistan is top of mind this week, and it provides an illustration, I think, of the costs of the alliance. Alliance or not, Australia would have wanted to be part of the 2001 invasion, responding to the terrorist attacks in the United States. Remember Howard actually invoked ANZUS for the first time in the wake of those attacks. But were it not for the alliance, would we have chosen to follow Bush into Iraq? With John Howard as Prime Minister, maybe we would. But the alliance meant that Australia was under pressure to do so, although there was not necessarily a convincing case in terms of our own national interest. Similarly, alliance considerations took us back into Afghanistan in 2005. We'd pulled out to clear the way for the Iraq participation. And the 2005 re-entry was just part of the insurance premium we pay for protection. In this context, I think it's worth noting that while Howard was always ready to say yes to Bush, he got some conditions in the process. Thus, in Iraq, Australian soldiers were deployed as safely as possible, and Brendan, no doubt, could elaborate on that. I think, incidentally, one interesting feature of the alliance politics is the interpersonal dynamic. While at one level, any Australian leader will get on with any US president in a broad sense, because they need to, there have been big differences in the personal relationships over the years. Think of the closeness of Holt and Johnson, as well as Howard and Bush. In contrast, think of the tension between Whitlam and Nixon. And it's interesting to speculate on the nature of the relationship between Biden and Morrison, which is as yet quite hard to read. And incidentally, the Prime Minister today more or less confirmed that he won't be able to make the September trip to the United States to celebrate the ANZUS anniversary, which he'd earlier hoped. Coming back to the pressures on Australia when the Americans want support and looking to the future, observers are starting to worry about the situation if there were military action between China and the US over Taiwan and Australian participation was sought. Can anyone imagine an Australian government saying no? Probably not, but I think a pertinent question when considering the alliance is, are Australian leaders too unwilling to push back on some occasions? Given that the alliance is firmly based not only on our national interest, but America's too, is there more flexibility to say no sometimes than we in fact think? So I'll leave it on that somewhat provocative question and hand back to you, Peter.
Michelle, thank you. The alliance that can say no. And even as I speak, Lisa has come back online. Obviously, a fairly unstable connection there, Lisa. Have you got audio? And it looks like you do. So let's give this a try and see if we can hear some comments from you. No, I'm afraid I think we might have lost Lisa again at that point. So Lisa, I see you're on mute. Are you able to unmute and let's see how your connection sounds?
Hi, Peter. Hopefully you've got me.
We can certainly hear you. The screen image is not so good, but let's go with audio and I'll hand over to you for some comments.
Look, thanks so much, Peter. And look, it's a delight to be back at ASPI after having only left a few weeks ago. Broadly speaking, I mean, Brendan and Michelle have given an excellent overview, I think, of the context of ANZUS, the context of the alliance. And I wanted to touch briefly, I think, on the broader US-Australia relationship in the context, particularly of how we engage with other partners and how we work with the US, particularly in the context of multilateral fora. I think one of the things that's quite striking is that the 2017 DFAT white paper, our foreign policy white paper, I should say, noted that without US engagement, the effectiveness and liberal character of the international order would erode. And I think it was quite prescient that that was being written at a time where really it could have been seen as not only a statement, but also a plea in many ways, as we sort of saw the actions that were taken under the then Trump administration in many ways. Whether you see that as sort of deferring from the traditional relationship in some ways, but certainly I think it sets up some of the tensions that we see in terms of potentially the US-Australia relationship. One of the points that's noted, for instance, is the domestic politics within the US at the moment, and how that ties back into perhaps the way that the US will engage on issues related to, for instance, trade is something that has been highlighted on a few occasions. I think what was interesting or striking at this point in time as well was, whilst in the last few years in terms of the US-Australia relationship, we saw the politics play out under Trump, we also saw discussions and considerations here in Australia about whether multilateralism was fit for purpose. We have found currently under the government that that's been a resounding yes with the findings of the multilateral audit. And we have seen a lot of agreement, I think, particularly with the new administration in terms of aligning and recommitting to a number of forums at the moment. For instance, the Paris Climate Accords and re-engaging with the World Health Organization. So I think that's an interesting point to be assessing the context of the relationship of Australia and the US within the context of the multilateral system. We've seen things such as human rights, strong democracies, and addressing challenges such as health and climate security, as well as the perils and opportunities that are presented by technology, reaffirmed by our two countries in forums such as the G7 that Australia was invited to engage in this year, but also more broadly in terms of the way our two countries engage in a variety of different forums. What I wanted to do briefly is, I guess, draw out a couple of those points for cooperation that I had an opportunity to highlight in the chapter, but then also very briefly, I think, turn to what does this mean in terms of the future of the US-Australia alliance. So where to next for cooperation in this broader global environment? Well, first of all, I think Australia and the US both have interests in ensuring that multilateral institutions are fit for purpose. Both have reaffirmed that. We see sort of the US in terms of its engagement and financial support in particular, which is really key. But I think what's really important here too, and this is a point that President Biden has made, is leading by the power of example. And I think that's something that the US and Australia in particular, throughout the history of ANZUS and the Alliance, have really attempted to do, not always well, but in terms of when we talk about shared interests and values, I think that's really important to that conversation. A second point is in supporting qualified candidates for elections to international organisations. And what I found was quite notable is, despite the lack of references in OSMIN communiques throughout the Trump administration to the UN or sort of cooperation in that multilateral space, this was one of the issues that was highlighted. And I think this goes back to the broader geopolitics that we're seeing now in terms of global cooperation and countries that are seeking to put forward candidates in different institutions. And the third point is in relation to being forward-looking and identifying opportunities to understand and support countries in the Indo-Pacific in different regional and multilateral processes. And I think here one of the issues that really looms large is around climate change and climate security. And this is, I think, something that Australia is at the moment, as we look at how our relationship evolves going forward, the balancing act in terms of looking at our domestic politics and what that means for our engagement with our alliance partner. So more broadly, just to sort of conclude some of my remarks, I think if we're looking to the future of the treaty, the one thing that I would really highlight, and sorry, I should say the alliance here, not necessarily the treaty, is in relation to how we engage. I think we are very good at looking back, reflecting importantly on the history, reflecting importantly on what were the challenges, the security implications, the threats to Australia and the US that were shared, that brought our two countries together. And I think we need to be a little bit more agile in looking at what that means, though, for the future. And here I think I would stress our engagement with future generations around what the alliance looks like. I know the Perth US Asia Centre, for instance, has done a fair bit of engagement with younger Australians around what they see as the future of the alliance. And they've referred to shared geopolitics interests in the Indo-Pacific and shared interests in addressing non-traditional security threats such as cybersecurity, pandemics, and climate, for instance. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And I will say on a personal note, as so many have, you know, early on my career kicked off by interning in Congress in the US. And I think for me that reaffirmed at a level throughout my career the importance of those people-to-people links And we have fantastic opportunities like Fulbright, which sees, you know, Australians and Americans go back and forth. But I think there's real opportunities there for engagement in building those people-to-people links, much along the lines of perhaps what we've seen with the new Colombo plan, for instance. So I think if we're trying to look at what the future of the alliance looks like, those people-to-people links are key, and I think they underpin a lot of the points that Brendan made around the political and the economic and defence as well. And I think that's something important that we need to consider going forward.
Lisa, that's excellent, thank you. And you know, my own people-to-people story is relevant too. I was in my very early 20s a Fulbrighter at the MIT, and in fact that saved me from my then career aspiration to become a medieval historian, and instead pointed me in the direction of defence and international security. So you know, these moments can be quite decisive in terms of forward life. We're getting some absolutely fantastic questions from our audience here, and I want to make sure that we actually touch on a few of them. An early one, which I think is just worth kind of like getting out onto the table, of course, is the experience of what's happening in Afghanistan. China is already saying publicly that what is happening in Afghanistan is a demonstration that America's allies cannot rely on the United States. I'd be interested in a quick comment from all three of you about that. Are we seeing changes in the mood of the United States, which really goes beyond any one administration, which is starting to lead to a questioning in the US about their alliances and how they should engage? Brendan, what do you think?
Well, it's obviously what we've seen unfold over the last few days in Afghanistan, indeed over the last month, has been tragic, confronting, and there will be quite a bit of blame to be shared, I would imagine. In terms of what China has said about the United States and relying on the United States, not something that I would certainly accept. The United States has proven to, from Australia's perspective, to be a reliable and steadfast partner. It doesn't mean it has always been perfect, and nor indeed has Australia always been perfect in terms of being an ally of the United States. But in my opinion, I think in some ways and to some extent, what we've seen in the circumstances of the US withdrawal in Afghanistan is a reminder of just how important it is for us to do everything we possibly can to see the United States continues to be an engaged nation that has a presence and an influence throughout the world. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Michelle, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think what China says is a very predictable line from China. Clearly, the United States at certain points becomes weary of wars, of particular wars, thinking that the cost-benefit analysis just doesn't work, that there are too many lives lost or money spent or whatever. Now, I noticed some are saying that it could have kept a very limited force there and maybe propped up the regime in Afghanistan. I'm not expert enough to know whether that analysis is correct or not, but clearly the whole story of Afghanistan is one of hope followed by disillusionment and loss. I was in Afghanistan just on a private trip in 2002, which was, of course, only months after the invasion, and there was a lot of hope there, especially among women and girls about the future, but also the whole, I think, population at that stage, or people across the board, I should say, were hopeful. But in the end, that was just dashed and worn away, and the Taliban, like many insurgent forces, are just very determined players over the long term, driven by ideology, playing the long game, and in the end they won. And the Americans were just not willing to stay the course anymore. And you can debate whether they should or whether they shouldn't have, but I think that the feeling in the United States was enough is enough.
Lisa, I'll put the same question to you, but also a little additional element. We've had one audience member ask about generational change in the United States and whether that gives rise to more or less affection for the alliance relationship. You also hinted at how that might take the alliance in different directions. I'd be interested for you to expand on that as well. But maybe firstly, the point about alliance reliability post-Afghanistan.
Look, I think that's an interesting question. I agree with Michelle there that we could come to, I guess, expect that assertion from China in terms of what we've seen unfolding. It has, I think, for a number of people in different communities, been very distressing to see what has unfolded in Afghanistan the last few days. I think part of the challenge with those events has been the communication around what has taken place. And this, I think, to some extent also ties into the generational challenge. For those that were around 20 years ago working in this space who, we remember what happened with 9/11, and we remember what invoked the reason for Australia to go in with the Americans and other partners to go into Afghanistan. Those memories are long, as are, I think, the discussions around all the other different tasks that were involved, the conversations around nation building, and the discussions around going in to support women and girls and their rights. And what we've seen play out in the last few days is, I think, not so much an uncertainty necessarily about the US's commitment to alliances. Perhaps its commitment, I think, to other partners is something that has come out of the events that have unfolded. And it will be interesting, I think, to see what that means going forward in terms of particularly US soft power. But what I would say, I think, in terms of some of the events that have unfolded is, I think there are some questions there about what it means when we talk about shared values for the US and Australia in terms of what we're looking to uphold and engage in, rather than necessarily, I think, pushing some of those conversations to the side. And we see this, I think, one of the issues that has been raised consistently in the last few days has been, well, what does it mean for those that work with us? What does it mean for women and girls who we've said is part of the reason that we're there to uphold their rights and that they've had all these rights achieved, and what happens when they roll back? So I think it's really important that there is a conversation about what this means and what this means in terms of our values in terms of the US and Australia and engaging in these environments overseas. It's not going to be the first time that a scenario like this unfolds. We've seen it happen in history previously. But I think a really key part about that is the communication and engagement that happens. And that's even more imperative in an environment where we have disinformation running around, where we have communities that are stovepiped in terms of the news and information that they're listening to. Briefly on the generational point that you alluded to, I think this is really key in a sense that a lot of our conversations around the relationship in the alliance tend to fall back on what it's emerged from. And I think for a new generation, that requires engaging with issues of concern to them. Whether that be COVID and what that means for health security going forward. What happens if we have another pandemic? How are the US and Australia going to cooperate and respond, and how are they going to work with partners to do that? What does that mean when we see increases in temperature and we see floods in Europe and we see fires taking place in Canada and the West Coast in the USA and Australia? What does that look like in terms of cooperation in the long term? So I think some real strategic commitments, but also ones that engage probably a more diverse and inclusive audience in those conversations is also really important as well.
Lisa, thank you. Well, the questions from the audience are so good. I don't need to draw on any of mine. I just want to keep asking what I'm reading here. Interesting question from Thomas Wilkins about, well, we've seen the NZ in ANZUS has kind of moved to a much more distant type of relationship. Is there scope to think about other countries that might potentially be ANZUS partners, or is that fanciful. So, for example, Japan. Do we need to put the J in ANZUS? What do you think, Brendan?
Well, Peter, if you obviously wrote some of it, but for those in the audience, if you read the ANZUS at 70, which AmCham's commissioned you to do, you can't help but conclude that if we want the alliance to grow and prosper, and certainly for us to mark a 100th anniversary, then we need to maintain the simplicity of it, to have it at a leader's level, to not complicate it by introducing another country into the alliance. I think the alliance itself has actually assisted us in our engagement. In fact, Rory Medcalf makes the point in his paper that this has enabled and enhanced our ability to engage Asia, and certainly not disadvantaged us in doing so. So I think for the alliance itself, and certainly for Australia and US interests, I think it needs to continue to be what is now a two-country alliance. And it's obvious that from the alliance, we've got the Quad. Australia has an outstanding relationship with Japan. The US-Japan memorandum is one of those 10 longest-lasting alliances in the world. I think complicating it with any other country coming in would be unwise.
What's your take on the Quad, Michelle? I mean, this has become the instrument of greatest public attention because I guess it's been lifted to head of government level in some recent meetings, with the promise of a physical head of government meeting at some stage when COVID will allow that. Does the Quad replace ANZUS? Does it complement it? Is it a part of ANZUS in any sense? What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with all Brendan has said about not complicating ANZUS and not extending it. I think that the fact of the intimacy of what is now a two-country bond is very important from Australia's point of view, gives us an in that would be somewhat diluted by inserting any other country. The Quad is obviously important and is, if I can put it this way and not sound too cynical about these things, is an institution in fashion. It's quite interesting that over the years, various groupings come in and out of fashion. For example, APEC a few years ago was very much the thing, but it seems to now have receded in importance. I'm not quite sure whether the same can be said for the G20, but it's not getting as much prominence as it did a few years ago. The Quad is very much the thing, certainly in our government's view at the moment, but it's a middle size grouping, as it were, tending to small rather than the larger end of the spectrum, and therefore has all the advantages of intimacy, if not the intimacy of the alliance, and brings together powerful countries, you'd say, and puts Australia in the league of key countries, and therefore I think serves our interests and will continue to be important in our thinking, in our foreign policy and defence thinking.
Lisa, we had one questioner observed, I thought very interestingly, ANZUS looks like a very Western sort of grouping, and how does that work with the region? And Bill Patterson asks, how can Australia encourage more substantive US engagement in the Indo-Pacific? I'm thinking that plays somewhat to your widened agenda of the things you think that a future ANZUS might address. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think briefly, to the point that was just discussed, and then into that point, I think one of the values of ANZUS and the US-Australia relationship is its frankness and its honesty. And I think when you start to add other countries into that mix, you begin to have that watered down perhaps a little bit, and that there are other forums where those discussions can take place and dialogues and so on. And I think to tie this into the conversation about how the US and Australia, first of all, I guess, might engage with others in terms of the relationship. I think, and I unfortunately can't recall who wrote this contribution in the chapter, but in the context of talking about the relationship with Indonesia, for instance, you know, that the US saw value in the way that Australia sees the region here and is able to perhaps interpret it from a different geographical perspective, but also in terms of the different nature of the relationships that we have here. And so I would suggest that that is really, I think, a strength that Australia brings to that conversation with the US. And also in terms of communicating, quite frankly, to the US, where it hopes to have it engaging in the region in terms of not only supporting Australia's interests, but those of peace and security, I think, of our broader region, whether it be in the Pacific or the Indo-Pacific and so on. So I think really that very narrow sort of partnership in the sense of between two countries enhances the ability, I think, of being to have those frank conversations and therefore ensure that we have the attention of the US, perhaps in a way that we wouldn't if there were other countries engaged in those discussions.
Interesting, thank you. Marcus Hellier specialises in asking some naughty questions, and I've got one from him that I've got to put to you, Brendan. It's just so good. Marcus writes, why is it that so many senior Australian politicians extol the alliance when they're in power, but in their retired golden years they become critics and sceptics? Fraser, Keating, the list is long. Why does their assessment of the cost-benefit change so dramatically? Brendan, over to you.
Well, it's probably a question directed more toward Michelle in terms of what motivates people that have what Gareth Evans described as relevance deprivation syndrome. Look, I think that's part of it, and part of the psyche of some people who've left public office is attracting attention to themselves by being critical of things which in office they would have supported, perhaps. Perhaps that's a part of it. But also I think that unconstrained by holding the office itself, they feel that they are able to express criticisms, and I obviously am not one of them, but and there are things to be critical of about the United States. There's no shortage of things to be critical about. But I also think that these people play a role, because for those of us who are deeply committed to the alliance, genuinely so, whether in office or not, I think people criticising aspects of the alliance and the way we manage the alliance play a very important role in challenging our orthodoxy and our thinking. But otherwise, and some of those critics, by the way, that Marcus has listed are unsurprising, shall I say.
Michelle,
and sometimes you, as they say, be careful what you wish for.
Michelle, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, just briefly, I think obviously when people are out of politics, they can be and often are more frank. Maybe there's something in what Brendan's saying about wanting to stay relevant. But of course, in the case of Malcolm Fraser, I think that it's a story of his politics migrating when he left office. Now, he always said that everybody else's politics had migrated and he'd actually stayed the same. But I think that that's a very doubtful proposition. I think he just ended up in a different political position from the one in which he started, and that was reflected in his attitude to the United States position, foreign policy and the alliance and many other things. He was consistent in some things, but not consistent in others over the years.
He did have some awkward experiences in the US, but that might be for another time.
That's very unkind.
I wanted to ask all of you about Taiwan. We've had probably half a dozen questions raising the issue of the security of Taiwan. What are your thoughts about that particularly in connection with the alliance relationship. I mean, we have had President Biden say, and his administration say, look, we want to consult with the allies. We are going to make more of a priority of that than happened under the Trump administration. So apply that logic to the Taiwan situation. Brendan, any thoughts from you?
Well, I have thoughts, but I also have a job I'd like to keep, so I won't express them all to you. But I think when Peter Dutton and Maurice Payne have their AUSMIN meeting, I would expect this will be one of the issues amongst a number of geopolitical significance and with a degree of urgency that I expect will be discussed. Should there be an attack on Taiwan from China, that will place Australia in an invidious position. I would expect that Australia would remain close to the United States, and it will not just be Australia. There will be other nations in the region that would also be drawn into it fairly quickly, in my view. I think one of the things that we, and Lisa was basically referring to this in relation to young people and their attitude to the alliance. And by the way, much of what's canvassed from young people in the paper is largely reassuring, I must say. But I think one of the things we need to be doing as a nation is actually educating Australians about Taiwan, its history, where it is, who it is, why it's important. We all understand it, we all know it, and we know the complexity of the challenges that are facing the United States, the region, our country in this. But I think we need to be educating people sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Michelle, any thoughts from you?
Well, as I mentioned in my initial comments, I think Taiwan would present a very, very difficult challenge for Australia if there was conflict there. I think that we would support the United States. Whether we should or not is a big question. It would depend to an extent, the question of whether we should on the circumstances, but this could very well be the thin end of the wedge of a wider conflict with China. If events in Afghanistan over the recent days have taught us anything, it's that things happen faster than you expect. And I'm not an expert at all in this area, but people talk about any conflict over Taiwan being years and years and years away, just as they talked about the Taliban taking over in 2 or 3 years and it ended up 2 or 3 weeks or whatever. So it is something that could confront an Australian government in at least the relatively near term, and it's a frightening prospect. I think it's a really frightening prospect.
Lisa, any thoughts from you? I think we might.
Yes, I think if you still have me there.
Yes, we do. No, we don't. And so that's, sorry, we'll just have to push on. Hopefully Lisa will be able to come back. I'm conscious of the time that has absolutely rocketed by, but Brendan, I did want to ask you specifically about the upcoming AUSMIN dialogue, which is most likely to happen in September, we imagine. And of course, you've been uniquely for this group in the position to actually attend a number of AUSMIN meetings in the past as Minister for Defence. Any advice for Peter Dutton that you might like to share with our audience about what how you would advise him as he prepares to go into his first AUSMIN?
Well, Peter, I remember at my first AUSMIN meeting seeing a former Defence Minister on the ABC's 7:30 program offering advice to me about what I should do. And I made a mental note to never be such a pathetic individual. So I don't have any public advice to offer Peter Dutton other than to be an Australian, We say what we mean what we say. So I will just leave it at that. But thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome. You see, that is the difference between someone in your situation and think tankers like Lisa and myself, because we're in the business of offering free advice whether people want it or not, you see. So, look, at this stage of proceedings, what I have to do, I'm afraid, is call a halt to the discussion and the questions. It's really been fascinating. I'd like now to invite onto the stage April Palmer-Lee. April is the CEO of AmCham in Sydney, and I understand she's going to be part of our chat fairly soon, assuming that the system is going to work for me. And April will offer a vote of thanks for our speakers. So let me just pause for a second to see if April can come online.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Magical. Hello, April. How are you?
Hello. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity to jump in here. I know I'm the only thing standing between after work drinks and dinner for many people, so I'll be brief. But first of all, I wanted to offer my thanks to Brendan Nelson for coming up with this idea and encouraging AmCham to approach ASPI to get it done. It was a very welcome project. We enjoyed collaborating very much with ASPI. Peter Jennings, Patrick Walters, Olivia, it's been a pleasure to work with all of you. And I found the discussion this evening with Michelle and Lisa very illuminating. In addition to reading the report, I think we covered a lot of topics around the alliance, the economic, political, diplomatic, educational, sports, cultural, and military ties that the United States and Australia share. So it's a very timely discussion, and I was happy to see how active and engaged the ASPI audience is. It's very encouraging when they type in so many questions. I'll be back on a webinar in 14 hours. Tomorrow morning, we're doing another webinar on the situation in the United States. We have the former Charge d'Affaires, Jim Caruso, Zoe Daniel, who spent 4 years covering Trump, and your board member, Stephen Loosley, on a webinar tomorrow morning. So maybe we can continue some of these discussions and questions tomorrow. But for now, I'd like to thank ASPI again for their collaboration on this tremendous publication and the launch tonight. And thank you to all of the speakers for participating. Have a good evening.
April, thank you so much. And let me add my own thanks, Brendan, Michelle, Lisa. Great to have your insights online. You can download this, of course, as with every ASPI publication, for free. But if you'd like a hard copy, write to us, and in due course we'll be able to get one to you. There's some wonderful photographs in the book, which Patrick spent a lot of time sourcing, including from the archives, and he's done a wonderful job. Books of this quality don't get produced just by the person that has the title of editor on the cover. There's a number of people at ASPI who worked quickly and hard and very effectively to deliver the product. Steve Clark, Zalia Lai, and Larissa Joseph from the internal teams did a fantastic job of design and editing and proofing the document. James Dixon, who's been a long-term external editor for us and is excellent, and Tony Kelly. Thank you to all of those folks. This has been a great conversation. I noticed someone said, oh, maybe we should have a second webinar, and we'll actually think about that, because there are a lot of really good people and ideas that we should perhaps bring onto a stage to chat further about it. So stay tuned, we might well do part 2. But we've now used up our hour, and certainly from my perspective, I completely agree with April that a glass of wine and something to eat is probably the order of the day. So thank you all for the audience. Thank you to speakers, April and Brendan from AmCham. Thank you for the excellent collaboration, which we've really enjoyed, and hopefully we can do something similar again in future. And with that, it's time to sign off. So Good evening from ASPI and AmCham, and we'll look forward to seeing you in future on another webinar. Bye for now.